And the topic of our discussion is about regional aspects of non-proliferation and arms control. As you might know, those are very interesting issues and very much linked to the previous topic we have discussed here in the morning about the NPT treaty and the NPT conference and the prospects. And now we will be going into the more detailed regional aspects. As the first speaker will be Mr. Jacek, who is actually representing here the European External Action Service. Actually, he will be speaking on behalf of the European Union, if I may say so, and he will be focusing on the Middle East and the issues which are linked to the issue of creation of the nuclear-free zone in Middle East. And as I understood, he's not going to mention about Iran, but well, I'm sure in the discussion, there might be some questions about this specific topic. Mr. Bylica, he is not only a special envoy of non-proliferation and disarmament for the European External Service, but he is as well, a very experienced Polish diplomat, being a diplomat in the Polish Foreign Service, and he serves as the head of the NATO Weapons of Mass Destruction Center. So, Mr. Bylica, the floor is yours, please.
Thank you very much, Ivan, and good morning to everyone. Actually, I used to work for NATO some years ago, and in this previous capacity, I actually co-organized a conference here in this very room with the Czech Republic in 2010, the annual NATO conference on arms control, disarmament and non-proliferation, which moves from capital to capital, and in 2009 it was organized in Warsaw, 2010 in Prague, then in Budapest, and actually next year many of us will meet at this same NATO event, which is going to be held in Qatar, so outside of NATO territory. Today I'd like to speak briefly and not really on behalf of the EU, because there is a certain difference. An EU statement is agreed by all 28 member states. In my case, it will be really some remarks on the issue of the WMD free zone in the Middle East, which already has been mentioned obviously in the discussions on the NPT. Establishing a zone free of all weapons of mass destruction and their means of delivery in the Middle East is an extremely, obviously challenging endeavor. I mean, it is challenging because of, I think, two types of reasons. One is the scope of prohibition, which this zone would cover. All the other zones, which were also mentioned earlier in this conference, are actually only nuclear-free zones, and even they took some time to establish. They took some time to be negotiated. So in this case, we want to deal with all types of weapons of mass destruction and their means of delivery. This is the first challenge. The second challenge is obviously the fact that this is about a region, we are talking about a region which has a history of political violence, of conflicts, of religious strife, which is rather unprecedented in the world. So this would make one rather pessimistic at the first glance. However, I think we should put things in perspective and remind ourselves that we are actually discussing this in Prague, in the center of Europe. A continent which for decades had also, had religious wars which were waged for decades, which had territorial conflicts which took centuries, where there was a rampant nationalism, terrible ethnic cleansing and genocide. A continent in which there was an unusual, unprecedented concentration of weapons and armaments. And yet, now, at least in most of this continent, we are witnessing an unprecedented level of integration and cooperation, of which the European Union is an embodiment, at least at most of this continent. And the levels of armaments have been reduced. Here, half a century ago, a number of nuclear weapons was larger than what we have globally around the world now. We actually have now less a couple of hundreds of nuclear weapons in the western part or in the central part of this continent. So things are possible. It takes, however, certain conditions and certain movement to do this. In the case of Europe, and this is something which is, I think, relevant very much for the Middle East experience, it was an interaction between detente, between confidence building and arms control and disarmament. And this is probably one of the major lessons which we can share with Middle Eastern countries, that the issues of disarmament and non-proliferation and arms control cannot be treated in isolation. They do not happen in one go. There is an interaction between building trust, dialogue, resolving other bilateral issues, and what is happening in the purely disarmament, arms control sphere. Sometimes this feedback goes in the negative direction. I mean, this is actually the case which we were discussing yesterday, currently between Europe and Russia. But for many years, it worked in the right direction. And I believe that this is exactly the sort of experience which we can share with the Middle East countries, and we have done so. The EU obviously very strongly supports the goal, which was the goal of creating the zone, but also the specific goal of holding a conference in 2012, as it was decided in 2010. It took a rather slow start of even appointing a facilitator took 1 year. So in the meantime, when there was no multilateral process for the conference, the European Union decided to organize 2 seminars with all countries of the region, which were held in 2011 and 2012 in Brussels, a kind of track 1.5 diplomatic initiative to enable the countries of the region to actually talk to each other, to create this platform of informal consultations. Then, over the last year, reportedly, the informal consultations have taken place in Switzerland, 5 rounds, with significant progress, reportedly, on the modalities of the conference to be held, which shows that the conference is really within reach. This obviously it must be a conference attended by all states of the region, and the region of the Middle East for these purposes is defined as in the International Atomic Energy Agency, so it encompasses the Arab states, it encompasses Israel and Iran. So modalities have to be acceptable to all countries of the region, but apparently this is within reach, and we can count on this to happen before the NPT review conference. Obviously, it is just one element of a longer process. Things do not happen in one go. One conference cannot resolve problems. There will need to be a structured follow-up to this, and the EU again will be ready to play a role. After the two seminars which I mentioned in 2011 and 12, we actually this year organized a workshop, a capacity building workshop for the diplomats from the region, which was attended both by Arab diplomats, official from the League of Arab States Secretariat, but also a couple of Israeli diplomats who came to Brussels for 2 days, and we enabled them to interact with people who had hands-on experience in negotiating other nuclear-free zones or in negotiating arms control and confidence-building agreements in Europe. The CFE treaty, the confidence and security building measures like the Vienna document, because it is important to learn from other cases, and it is important to know that some stepping stones towards the zone exist. And this is what I would like to highlight in this overall theme of progress, of not focusing on one event, but rather on a process. The stepping stones towards the zone, I would suggest, are the already existing treaties and arrangements which could be subscribed to by the countries of the region. And I have in mind here the Chemical Weapons Convention. The NPT is obviously a tough nut to crack, but the CTBT, which was discussed in the earlier panel, and the Hague Code of Conduct against proliferation of ballistic missiles. Those are already existing, functioning instruments, like the Hague Code of Conduct, where over 100 countries already subscribe to, and it's a transparency measure, it's a confidence-building measure, exchanging information on ballistic missile capabilities, providing pre-launch notifications for ballistic missile launches. This is something which in the Middle East could play a very positive role. It's there. A coordinated subscription, say, by Israel and its neighbors to the Hague Code of Conduct, to HCOC, could be a stepping stone towards this overall goal of establishing the zone. The same with CTBT. Exchange of information through the international monitoring system, but also an obligation not to test a nuclear weapon. This could be a major confidence-building measure. So I would call upon the countries of the region to think in these terms, not to focus on one event only, but to think in terms of a process for which stepping stones, building blocks already exist. But dialogue is a prerequisite. Establishing diplomatic relations, it's difficult to negotiate anything when you do not recognize each other. So the concept of confidence-building measures in support of the zone is actually something which I believe needs to be enhanced and needs to be furthered. And as I said, the EU will be ready to assist either in the run-up or more likely in the follow-up to the Helsinki conference, which we very much hope will happen early next year in time for the review conference. Thank you.
Jacek, thank you very much for your speech and for your thoughts and for your ideas. I think it was quite interesting. A year ago, when there was a Prague conference, Prague Agendas conference here, Jakov Laeva was here, and he was optimistic, and I'm glad you know that you're optimistic too. That's good. So let us move to the second topic, so we will move from the Middle East to more distant region. It's for the Asia, and I would like to introduce Mark Hibbs, who is a senior associate in Carnegie's nuclear policy program, and he is an expert in the areas of emerging nuclear programs in Asia, as well, including China and India, and he has been very much involved in exposing the clandestine procurement in Europe related to the gas centrifuge uranium enrichment programs in Iran, Libya, North Korea, and Pakistan. His last paper, which I unfortunately didn't read, but it would be interesting, is The Future of Nuclear Supplies Group, which was published in December with Mark, but I think today you will more speak about North Korea. The floor is yours.
That's better, I think. Thank you, Ivan, and good morning. I want to thank the participants once again for inviting me to this meeting this week. It's been a great pleasure to be here and interact with Czech colleagues and people from other parts of the world that I don't get a chance to see very often. Right now with North Korea, we're hearing radio silence. We've been here before, we've been here now, and we're probably going to be here in the future for quite a while. One of the problems that we're facing currently is that there's just very significant divisions among the powers who have been talking with the North Koreans for this since 2003 about how to proceed. And at present, we're confronted by a situation which doesn't provide us very much encouragement. In a nutshell, since 2003, we've had a decade of diplomacy which has failed to deliver. Right now, the narratives and the goals of the parties to this process in fundamental ways do not line up with each other. There continues to be considerable uncertainty about what is happening inside of North Korea, making it very difficult for the parties to diplomacy to converge their positions. And then lastly, the absence of substantiated information about the technical status of North Korea's nuclear weapons program provides little guidance about how diplomacy should proceed. I'm going to just very quickly try to illustrate some of those points by just laying out what I see to be the different narratives that are on the table. And that may give us an idea of why things aren't moving anywhere. The DPRK's narrative is clear. According to the DPRK, the United States introduced nuclear weapons into South Korea, forcing North Korea to make alliances with the Soviet Union and China, but without introducing nuclear weapons. The United States dismissed North Korean peace initiatives over many years and instead carried out military exercises which threatened North Korea with nuclear weapons. Then North Korea joined the NPT, it signed the North-South Denuclearization Agreement, and it concluded the agreed framework in 1994. That froze the nuclear program, but in the North Korean narrative, the US failed to deliver on light water reactors and nuclear security assurances. The US then moved forward in nullifying the agreed framework, permitting the nuclear threat in North Korea to reemerge. North Korea then carried out its first nuclear test in 2006 to, as it believed, restore the nuclear balance in the Korea Peninsula. Without the nuclear development by North Korea, the United States could do to North Korea, in the North Korean view, what it accomplished in Libya. North Korea wants mutual respect, including acknowledgement of North Korean nuclear deterrence. The main goal of diplomacy for North Korea in this narrative is nuclear equity and survival of the regime in the possession of nuclear weapons. Then there's China. In defiance of international efforts to denuclearize the Korean Peninsula, the Chinese view, the Chinese are carrying out nuclear tests and developing long-range ballistic missiles. South Korea has become instead more influential, and it's learned to rest its security upon the provision of goods and services to its population and not upon the development of weapons of mass destruction. So it's going to be up, in the Chinese view, to other countries to improve the security environment, demonstrate to the North Koreans that their security can be met without nuclear weapons, and the six-party talks, which have been with us for a decade because, in the Chinese view, of Chinese mediation, these talks should be the basis for moving forward. This makes clear that even in the Chinese view of things, despite the fact that China has a very good relationship with the North Koreans, the Chinese themselves are not even sure if Kim is in charge. There's a total absence of trust that's developed over a period of time between China and North Korea, but primarily in the Chinese view of this, it's up to the United States to solve this problem. The problem in North Korea, in the Chinese view, is a bilateral problem between the US and North Korea. In the view of some Chinese people involved in this process, they tell me that in their view, the US should be offering money and security guarantees to the North Korean regime. They say that China would be happy with any deal that the US and the North Koreans conclude. So, in their view, the outcome of diplomacy should be a stable situation. It would be permissible, probably, in the Chinese view, for North Korea to have nuclear weapons under some scenarios. There are questions about Korean unification. The Chinese are not committing themselves to that in our lifetimes. Then we have the United States. The US right now is in a wait-and-see mode. It's basically observing what is essentially a de facto moratorium on diplomacy since the third nuclear test in 2013. For the United States, from the beginning, the main goal of diplomacy has been the denuclearization of North Korea. The North Koreans made some overtures earlier this year. They didn't really move in the direction of denuclearization, so it appeared as if the US government wasn't really interested. In the US view, the agreement that was made with North Korea in 1994, the agreed framework is history. There's been no progress at all since 2001. The six-party talks process is totally dysfunctional, is going nowhere. And the joint statement, which was part of this from 2005, which is seen by some people outside of the US as a point of departure to build on, this view is not shared by most people that I know in the US government. They basically believe that this statement, because it was crafted in 2005, a year before the first nuclear test, that it is not the way to go forward. I think the US position could be summarized by saying that the US government wants to start over, but they don't know how to do that yet. We have, in addition to that, at the table, South Korea and Japan. The South Koreans share many attributes of the US position, but they add, of course, the unique and overriding agenda of Korean unification. There are also maybe some ambiguities about how denuclearization in North Korea would unfold. For Japan, denuclearization, as in the case of the US, would be paramount, but there's the additional problem that Japan is facing about resolution of hostage-taking, which is similar to some humanitarian-related problems that the South Koreans are facing. Lastly, we have the Russian Federation. Russia is not threatened by North Korea in its view, and Russia's engagement is instead founded on Russia's commitment to the non-proliferation regime and its commitment to the region. The Russians believe in their narrative that the consequences of nuclear weapons in the possession of North Korea would be totally negative. Like China, however, and unlike the United States, the Russians believe that the six-party process is still viable and is a way forward. Like the US, the Russians, and unlike the Chinese, see denuclearization as the reason and the modality for the talks. There shouldn't be any focus in the Russian view toward the transformation of North Korea's economy or its regime. Unlike China, however, the Russians believe that these talks should be multilateral. They also believe increasingly in developments that we've discussed here this week, that the North Koreans, to a certain extent, are justified in resisting change and threats to the extent that the US threat to North Korea is disproportionate to the threat which North Korea poses for the United States. So in this Russian view, the US should be informed that military interventions in places like Libya and Iraq and elsewhere, Afghanistan, are things which provide a rationalization for North Korea's pursuit of nuclear weapons. So these are basically the narratives. I spent a little time on that to describe it because I just want to underscore why things right now are not going very well. The parties just do not agree for important issues such as the role of the United States versus the role of multilateral diplomacy in holding responsibility for the outcome of diplomacy in this part of the world. And then the other major issue is that the goals of diplomacy itself with North Korea are not in all these scenarios compatible. We have Korean unification on the table. We have denuclearization of North Korea. We have establishment of a buffer zone, which would be favorable to China and perhaps Russia in some scenarios. And finally, the parties do not agree that the six-party process should continue. The Chinese and the Russians want to do that. The US wants to start over. The US wants the Chinese to play a larger role. The Chinese say it's up to the United States, and so on. So where do we go next? And the answer to that is, in consequence of what I've described, it's not a very optimistic picture. In the meantime, I would suggest that maybe a minimalist to-do list might include a couple of points. The US and the South Korean government might consider lowering the profile of their military exercises, keeping in mind that in 1992, when the US government and the South Koreans did that, the North Koreans responded by ratifying their safeguards agreement with the IEA, and today we're hearing some suggestions from North Korea that these South Korean US military activities are standing in the way of an agreement by North Korea not to test nuclear weapons. So this may be one way of moving forward. Secondly, in the background, we should explore the possibility that a fresh face at the table might unlock some positive developments. That might include Mongolia, a country which enjoys good relations with the United States, is eager to lift its diplomatic profile in the region, and which could possibly serve as a bridge in the negotiations to China and Russia. Thirdly, in this way, we move forward. There might be a way of, through confidence building, to negotiate a moratorium on nuclear testing by North Korea, perhaps a separate or related negotiation on missile launching, confidence building measures including fact-finding missions, statements on sanctions and absence of hostile activities. And then ultimately, at the end of the day, there will have to be a discussion about the Chinese aggressive, ambitious agenda to go forward with the DPRK in a very activist way. This has been rejected by Western countries. It's not accepted by South Korea. It's not accepted by China or by the United States. So all this would have to be rediscussed. It isn't clear how it's going to go forward. The key point, however, would be that the lesson that we learned is that squeezing North Korea isn't going to work because there's no real leverage. We've had a discussion here this week that's talked about the prospect for sanctions in Russia. That depends on an understanding of the leverage that sanction-making countries would have over that country. But in North Korea, a discussion like that is totally out of place. There's just, this country has been under sanctions. There's very little to do that would not be very difficult, and it might be marginally not very effective. And I think in looking forward to the treatment of the agenda to have a UN resolution on human rights in North Korea, what we hear from people in the United States and China so far would appear to indirectly acknowledge that this kind of pressure on North Korea will not have any beneficial effect. Finally, regarding sanctions, it's also difficult to move forward in any more intensified sanctions regime because the nuclear development in North Korea doesn't provide us a picture with any confidence about how effective the sanctions have really been. If you look into the open literature on the nuclear program in that country, you will see that experts strongly disagree about whether the North Koreans have significantly failed since 2006 to develop a first-generation nuclear weapon, or instead that in fact it's making great progress toward the development of advanced and smaller boosted weapons. So in the absence of clarity about this, the international community cannot gauge how dire this crisis really is. Russian experts will tell you that they, at least some of them, do not believe that North Korea right now has nuclear weapons. There are Chinese and US counterparts who seem to conclude that North Korea does have nuclear weapons. So this is an area which does not contribute to resolve in solving this crisis. And finally, the past should teach us to be very circumspect in drawing any conclusions. On the basis of intelligence estimates that were made in the early 1990s by Western powers, including the United States, which asserted that within just a very small period of time, perhaps 1 or 2 years, North Korea, if outside of the NPT, would have nuclear weapons, the US, supported by other states, rushed into what was a flawed agreement with North Korea, which rested on a fragile bilateral relationship between the US and North Korea that in fact proved unsustainable in the absence of political will both in the US and in North Korea, and which did not include anything which even closely resembled a verification agreement. The verification lesson, which we hope that the EU 3+3 have learned in dealing with Iran, might also imply that in the future diplomacy with North Korea in any constellation is going to be more difficult. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mark, for your remarks and wonderful overview of the situation on the North Korea. I think it was quite interesting, and many good new ideas were put on the table. I think we can return back to them in a Q&A session. And now let's move back to Europe. And on my left-hand side, it's Stephen Pifer, who is a fellow diplomat, retired ambassador. He now works as a director of the Arms Control and Non-proliferation Initiative, and he is a senior fellow at the Brookings Institution. And he used to work as a diplomat in the US State Department. He used to be a US ambassador to Ukraine, and I think you are going to tell us something about the East and West.
Well, thank you very much, and let me thank the organizers of the conference for including me. I find myself in the somewhat awkward position of being the last speaker on the last panel of a 2-day conference that's been very rich and full, in which almost everything has been said, but it hasn't been said by me. So let me talk a little bit about European arms control issues in light of the East-West relationship. And I'll start by talking about where relations between West and Russia are. Certainly they were problematic a year ago, but Russia's military occupation of Crimea, support for the separatists in eastern Ukraine, and the Russian military intervention in August directly into Ukraine has put the East-West relationship at its lowest point since the end of the Cold War. And unfortunately, when you look at the situation, it's difficult to escape the conclusion that at this point in time, Russia would prefer a frozen conflict in eastern Ukraine to an actual resolution. So I think we have to assume that this crisis will be with us for some time to come. And unfortunately, looking at President Putin's comments yesterday in his State of the Nation address, it does not give one much confidence that there's going to be a change in Russian course. Now, that situation makes arms control more difficult, but it also makes arms control both more necessary and more valuable. Why does it make it more difficult? Because Russian aggression against Ukraine has violated the post-Cold War order, violated the primary rule, which is you do not use military force to take territory from other states. It's an issue for the United States because of the Budapest Memorandum, which was signed 20 years ago today, in which the United States, Britain, and Russia committed themselves to respect the territorial integrity, the independence, the sovereignty of Ukraine, and not to use force or threaten to use force against Ukraine. And I think Russian actions, Russia's violation of that memorandum, impose obligations on the United States and Britain to take actions in response. And I would just say in passing that the comment I heard this morning that it is Ukraine that has violated the Budapest Memorandum is one of the most unique assertions I've heard about that document and in no way corresponds to reality. We have a situation now where West-Russia relations are at a very low point, and that makes it very difficult to proceed on arms control issues in Europe. But I would add two observations. One is arms control questions in Europe, and I'm talking about issues such as missile defense, non-strategic nuclear weapons, conventional arms control, were all stuck a year ago. Ukraine makes those issues more complicated, but a year ago we were not seeing particular progress on those issues. And on perhaps a more optimistic note, I would also recall that even during very difficult periods of the Cold War, when you had very difficult relationships between the United States and the Soviet Union, there were still times where Washington and Moscow found it in their mutual interest to deal in arms control questions. Now, why is arms control needed? I think what we've seen over the last 10 months is a move towards a remilitarization of security relations in Europe after a period of 20 years where military questions seem to be moving to the background. You have Russian military modernization, which is ongoing, but it's coupled in what makes it more difficult is, again, Russia's readiness to use military force, as demonstrated in Crimea and eastern Ukraine. You now have NATO reacting with the deployment of military forces into the Baltic region and the Central and Eastern European area. And this creates a situation where I think arms control would be more necessary, as would rules of the road, when you have the militaries operating in closer proximity to one another. And I would argue that the current situation also demonstrates the value of arms control. The new Strategic Arms Reductions Treaty, my guess is, seen in a more valuable light, both in Washington and Moscow, because at a time when the United States and Russia are heading towards a more confrontational relationship over Ukraine, New START gives both sides some confidence that the strategic offensive force relationship is bounded, that there's predictability and there's transparency. Now, I'd like to talk about where situations are and some possible ways to move forward, but I'll say at the beginning, I think two things have to happen before you can see progress on some of these European arms control questions. First of all, there needs to be some kind of a change in the broader political atmosphere, which will turn on developments over Ukraine. And the second point, I would argue, is that there needs to be a different Russian approach to some of these particular questions. I'll start with the missile defense issue. And it's an important issue in and of itself, but it's also important for those of us who would like to see nuclear force reductions, because Moscow has linked further reductions to a resolution of the questions, the differences on missile defense. I would also like to see this resolution found, and it may be very difficult, but if there was some way where NATO and Russia could get back to 2011, when they were actually talking about ways to cooperate in this area. But you have two different positions here. Russia has requested or demanded a legal guarantee, a treaty, that American missile defenses would not be oriented against Russian strategic offensive forces. The United States and NATO are prepared to provide a political assurance to that effect, but not a treaty, and that's the standoff. The Russian legal guarantee also, they say, should be accompanied by objective criteria, by which they mean limits on numbers, types, and locations. It appears to be a resurrection of the anti-ballistic missile treaty. Now, I'm not speaking for the US government. I personally actually would see a logic to the Russian position if there is greater equivalence between strategic offensive forces and missile defense. If you had a degree of equivalence, it would not be inappropriate to say if you have a legally binding treaty limiting strategic offensive forces, there should be a legally binding treaty limiting missile defenses. But you do not today have equivalence. Far from it, there is a huge gap. In 2018, when the New START treaty limits take full effect, Russia will be able to deploy 1,500 strategic warheads on its intercontinental ballistic missiles and submarine-launched ballistic missiles. And at that time, at most, the United States will have 44 interceptors in Alaska and California with a velocity capable of intercepting a strategic ballistic missile warhead. 1,500 to 44, to my mind, is a large gap, and you don't need a treaty at this point. Perhaps some kind of a transparency arrangement which would allow the sides to understand where missile defense programs are going and allow them to assess whether there in fact is a true threat or not, and if there is, they could then take appropriate steps, might be a better way forward. On non-strategic nuclear weapons, you have a call by President Obama a year and a half ago for dramatic cuts. NATO has also offered a discussion on confidence nuclear weapons might well be the outcome of an agreement, depending on the agreement's terms. But I do not see any readiness in Washington or in NATO to accept that as a precondition to get to the negotiation. It does seem to me that the United States and Russia need to get to non-strategic nuclear weapons at some point, because the distinction between strategic and non-strategic is increasingly becoming blurred. My own rule of thumb is any nuclear weapon that goes off near me is going to be strategic. I would also note that the Russian position is that, as articulated by Foreign Minister Lavrov, is that the next step in US-Russian negotiations should be multilateral, bringing in other countries. That would argue for the United States and Russia beginning to tackle non-strategic nuclear weapons, because when you look at the arsenals of third country nuclear weapon states, only Britain has an arsenal which is solely strategic under New START definitions. China, France, everybody else have weapons that are non-strategic. And if Russia is not prepared to negotiate on non-strategic nuclear weapons with the United States, it's going to be very difficult for Russia and the United States to ask these other countries to join negotiations. So I think those are some of the differences. If we could begin to move, it's probably too much to go directly into a negotiation on numbers, but you could begin with confidence and security building measures as first steps. Transparency measures on numbers, types, and locations. The sides might consider undertaking a no increase commitment. US non-strategic weapons are not going to increase. My sense is that Russian numbers are likely to go down, so this would be a politically useful commitment. The American non-strategic weapons are not on delivery systems. My understanding is most or all Russian systems, the weapons are not on delivery systems. Perhaps codifying that with a confidence building measure on demating might be a way to go. So there are a number of things that the sides could undertake that would at least begin to move forward if there was a readiness on all sides to actually begin the discussion. The third area, I think, is conventional forces, and again, this is important in part because Russia has said it will not talk or does not want to discuss non-strategic nuclear weapons until there is something done on conventional forces. Unfortunately, the conventional forces in Europe treaty regime is dead. It began dying in 2007 when Russia suspended its obligations under that treaty. But in a way, I'm not sure that this is something that needs to be an immediate focus. If you look at the numbers of tanks, artillery, armored personnel carriers, attack helicopters, and fighter aircraft in NATO holdings and Russian holdings, I believe all of those numbers are below not only the CFE treaty limits, but also below the adapted CFE treaty limits. So I would argue that at this point in time, perhaps the focus in conventional arms control should shift to confidence and security building measures. And there are the opportunities to build on documents such as the Vienna document on CSBMs. Could you look at ways, for example, to raise the number of observations allowed in that document? Lower some of the thresholds for activities that would trigger observations and notifications? Are there things that could be done with the Open Skies Treaty that again might contribute to greater confidence? So I think there are a number of things here that would begin to move us forward in a more positive way if we could get to the point where we could begin to sit down and actually talk about some of the problems. But it does seem to me that when you look at these three sets of issues, non-strategic nuclear weapons, missile defense, and conventional arms control, there are ways to move forward. And there are actually, I think, a fairly wide set of ideas for moving forward on these questions in a way that would both bolster security and stability in Europe at a time when security and stability in Europe need bolstering. But I think it's going to turn first on two questions, as I said. One will be a more positive change in the political atmosphere, and then second, a change in the Russian approach to some of these questions on the particular issues. Thank you.
Stephen, thank you very much for your very detailed and very technical, I would say, speech and very innovative approach as well to possibility to again restart the negotiation of arms control. By you saying you were the last one of the last, so actually it's the last period for the Q&As. So I would like to ask you, those who are here, and if possible, introduce yourself and use the mic and be short and precise. Thank you. So here and there.
Thank you very much, Chair. I'm Vladimir Kozin, Senior Advisor, Russian Institute for Strategic Studies, Moscow. When I listened to a colleague of mine, Stephen, I realized by 100% that hostile mood is preoccupying our bilateral agenda. It's not our fault. We have not initiated this kind of mood. But nevertheless, permit me to answer to all three clusters of your remarks. Ukraine and Crimea. We have not done any aggression against Crimea. Otherwise, we will be summoned to the United Nations or somewhere else and explain why we violated the terminology approved by UN General Assembly session, terminology of aggression. True, there were Russian servicemen in Crimea under 4 Ukrainian-Russian naval basing and naval sharing agreements signed by Kiev. There was no shooting at all. Nobody was killed or even injured when Crimea ran a free and democratic referendum earlier this year. More than that, many Ukrainian soldiers decided to join the Russian armed forces in Crimea after that. So, using the right of self-determination, we reunited our land to Russia. It has been our land not from 1783, when it was officially joined the Russian Empire. My ancestors inhabited this area more than 1,000 years ago, when Knyaz, or old Duke Vladimir, has been baptized and later on baptized other Russians in Kiev. As to Donbass or Novorossiya, we have not sent any Russian GI to Donbass. There is no need. Freedom fighters have 7.5 million population. They have enough forces, manpower, and military hardware they captured from Ukrainian armed forces. By the way, soon after the takeover in Kiev, resistance fighters had only six AK-47 Kalashnikov assault rifle, no more. After that, they acquired anything except aircraft and Buk missile. 10 Russian soldiers who lost their way and found themselves in Ukrainian territory, they have been removed without any punishment by Ukrainian side. Likewise, 460 Ukrainian GIs officially came to the Russian territory. We also returned them. without any difficulties. But unfortunately, the West doesn't see that nearly 1 million ethnic Ukrainians, the holders of Ukrainian passports, moved into the Russian territory after this genocide conflict erupted. And 500,000 became Ukrainian IDPs, moved to other areas in the center, in the heartland of Ukraine. We are supportive of the Minsk II agreements signed recently in September. And we are continue for this dialogue with Kiev. We never interrupted diplomatic, economic, cultural, and whatnot ties, because it would be a grave mistake for us to say goodbye to the population of Ukraine. We have very close ethnic, national, historic, cultural, and whatnot ties. Second, arms control agenda. Yes, we are still asking the American side to pull back all tactical nuclear weapons from Europe, simply because we'd like to have an equal footing position before the relevant talks might commence. Because all our T and W have been returned to the Russian land, not American. So it means that the Russia will downsize its tactical nuclear weapons on its own land, but you will downsize your T and W outside the United States. As to modernization of T and W, you will have up to 900 B-6112 highly sophisticated free-fall nuclear bomb in the near future. And delivery systems will also modernize by the year 2075. The United States will also have modernization of SOA systems. You will have to create absolutely new strategic offensive arms triad. I don't know, but I've already told you, Stephen, that during the current US administration, no arms control agreement between us is possible, is feasible. It's impossible. I don't know what might be in the future after probably a Republican candidate will become the next US president. I don't know. But nevertheless, we are still confronted with a tremendous bucket full of military technical difficulties. For example, just one thing. We suggested twice to the previous and current US administrations, let's subscribe to the agreement like INC-C, Incidents at Sea Prevention Agreement, which covers surface combatants and submarines on the surface. But we suggested to proliferate this kind INC-C accord to submarine while submerged, nuclear submarines, SSNs and SSBNs, at least not to send them to combat training areas of our two sides. All administrations in the US told, no go. We wouldn't like to draw grids in the world oceans, but we're not supposing to draw grids as well in the world oceans. As to BMDS, I told on yesterday's remark that a new Chicago triad has been created involving 3 assets: strategic, nuclear, conventional, and ballistic missile defense assets. So each triad will complement the other 2. It's a forward-based assets. The first director of the US Missile Defense Agency, Lieutenant General Kadish, revealed why you are moving these BMD assets very close to our shores, to our territory. Simply to intercept while missiles are fired, because he said that if they approach to the continental USA, it will be probably too late to react properly. That's quite understandable. Well, but we are not moving our BMD assets close to the US shores. As to CFE, yes, we would like to prepare CFE 2 without flank limitations, that it should be on equal footing, and this CFE should be ratified by all countries who desire to sign it. For example, the previous CFE has not been ratified by no NATO member countries, participants in the treaty, but Russia has done it. There is a huge supremacy in the conventional forces. Admiral Stavridis, before his retirement, made a clear-cut statement. He said that NATO alliance altogether has 24,000 combat aircraft and 800 blue water navy. That's a tremendous amount. We are incomparably low. We can't afford this. And we do not have NATO alliance like you do. So what to do? We should not wait. We have to talk to each other. Despite some difficulties, misunderstandings and criticism, because ex-Prime Minister of UK, Winston Churchill, once observed, "Jaw, not war." And Mr. Niet, Mr. No, Mr. Andrei Gromyko, Soviet ex-foreign minister, used to say that, guys, it's better to have 100 days of talks and negotiations rather than a single day of war. So no wars should erupt anywhere. If the United States and the Russian Federation and the European Union imposed economic and financial sanctions against current regime in Kiev, the war in Donbass would have ceased immediately in 24 hours. But unfortunately, you are offering helping hand, moral assistance, financial assistance, some voices to send lethal weapons to current regime, ultra-nationalist, very ultra-nationalist. That's very bad. That's very bad for all of us and for Ukrainians as well. We are not happy that young generations are being treated as a hardliners, nationalists, and some of them with a neo-fascist, neo-Nazi feelings. Well, thank you very much, and thank you for giving me such an opportunity to respond, but I had to respond. Otherwise, there will be unfair, right, play. Yes, I have to respond. But nevertheless, I'm ready to listen to any criticism, to me personally, to the Russian Federation. It's normal procedure. In a democratic society, there should be vox populi, vox dei. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much for your statement. I think, Stephen, you would like to respond, and because you have to leave at 1 o'clock, so, and we will be going a little bit later, so actually to have more time. So actually I give you now the floor, and then we will move to the other questions, please.
Well, I would agree with your last comment about we do not want war. It's a little bit harder to agree with much else of what you said, Vladimir. First of all, on the tactical nuclear question, again, I think that there's a way to get a desirable outcome in Russia, but it's going to involve a negotiation, not a demand for a precondition. Second, you talked about modernization of American strategic offensive arms, which is coming. That will happen in the 2020s. But I would point out that right now it's Russia that's building the Bore-class ballistic missile submarine, the Bulava-class submarine-launched ballistic missile, the Topol-M, and multiple variants of